When the ancient vampire Count Orlok confronts the female lead Ellen towards the third act of 2024's Nosferatu, he refers to himself as an appetite. Ellen says he cannot love.
I cannot, yet I cannot be sated without you.
She awoke his passion, and it calls to her own, so he claims. She is not for mankind. He must consume her. But she must come willingly, even if that willingness is out of an attempt to save the people she loves in this world. Succumb or perish. Robert Eggers' Nosferatu is an expanded remake of the 1922 German film, and that film is a loose adaptation of Bram Stoker's novel, Dracula, with some changes to avoid copyright. However, the film maintains a familiar narrative of Eastern European vampire coming west to bring calamity. You can check out Be Kind Rewind's video for more, or check out this Kaz Rowe video for more information about the court case itself. The, in my opinion, most significant change is that the two major female characters from the book, Mina Harker and Lucy Westenria, are symbolically combined into Ellen Hutter. Although some people will argue that Anna, the other woman, is a Lucy XP, I don't think they're that similar. Like Mina, Ellen is married to the young man sent on this mission to pre-game a psychosexual politics of real estate, being hunted by a vampire. In this case, it is Thomas rather than the Jonathan Harker of the novel. However, Mina in the original Dracula was, by Victorian standards, at least a very content, mild-mannered, happy woman in a relatively equal partnership with a man who adored her and would die for her. She is believed and protected, and she lives through the battle between the men and Dracula. Lucy, by comparison, is a tragic figure. She is turned from a young ingenue into a vampire, a symbolic abomination of gender norms. Despite the fact that Lucy had 3 suitors in the book, it is treated as ingenue-like as possible, with the men being drawn to her due to her inherent goodness. But the very fact that she is a figure of desirability is notable, especially to Dracula, who decides to take her as well. As a vampire, Lucy is a child killer and less personified as she tries to seduce her former fiancé. Her eyes blazed with unholy light, and the face became wreathed with a voluptuous smile. With a careless motion, she flung to the ground, callous as a devil, the child that up to now she had clutched strenuously to her breast, growling over it as a dog growls over a bone. Her staking in the book is an overt penetration symbolism, the male ego taking back control in a pantomime of power. And you can see more of this on my video about Mina Harker from 2 Halloweens ago, from her transformation from a fairly independent woman to Dracula's girlfriend. And I say all this at the beginning to illustrate that by folding these 2 characters together, a new woman appears. One with a more overtly sexual link to the monster that has been the subject of discussion since the 1920s. And when it comes to sex, the Marvel Cinematic Universe has hollowed lust out to like shonen levels of vitriolic best friends running towards each other and intense forehead presses of love, because God forbid anyone kisses anymore.
You're a pain in my ass, you know that.
But now, smut is kind of back on the table. It has taken over and caused repeated crash outs on Book Talk. Monster lovers are entering a new golden era of content. In that context, what does the sexual story in Nosferatu mean? Is it erotic? Is it kinked? Consensual? Grooming? Is it a dark romance? All of the above? Let's discuss. The term Gothic comes from the style of architecture popular in Europe that would become associated with the Middle Ages. Painted arches, buttresses, stained glass windows. Works of Gothic fiction got that name because these homes became the setting for the aesthetic of the Gothic novel, particularly because during the Renaissance, that period decided to codify and craft an image of the Middle Ages period as synonymous with being ignorant, cruel, and savage. So, as the Industrial Revolution would emerge centuries later, it makes sense why writers would go back to this period and aesthetic to harken back to a dreary past. The Castle of Otranto, which is this is the fourth time I mentioned this book, would become the first Gothic novel in this light by English author Horace Walpole. It featured the elements of Gothic fiction we know today, including a family of nobility that is slowly eating itself through a deplorable patriarch, subtle queer undertones, and romance at the center of it. Romance in terms of fiction has traditionally two meanings. One is, of course, the love romances that we know today that usually end with a happily ever after, and should to be considered a romance. But they also mean stories with fantastical elements to them. In contrast, the novel at the time was seen as rooted in realism, ordinary experiences. That's why so many of those stories have people's names as the titles, to make them seem like these stories about real people and intimate biographies. And that's why you get your Tom Joneses, your Clarissas, your Belindas, etc. Following Walpole, many female authors would craft what Ellen Moores would define as the female Gothic. Authors like the Bronte sisters, Anne Radcliffe, Mary Shelley, Clara Reeve, etc. They were the ones who really brought to focus the sexual taboos and sexual politics that would be so key in the Gothic genre and for Gothic romances. For writers, especially women, Gothic horror and ghost stories became vehicles to tell coming out stories about young women growing up in a patriarchal environment and having a symbolic patriarch in the forms of a ghost or a monster to fight. The Gothic heroine story is not simply one of self-awareness in which the burden is the individuals alone. However, it necessarily implicates and indicts the culture that refuses her voice. In approaching the Gothic romance, we must examine the intersection between Gothic mode and romance, how both function symbiotically to provide entertainment, fantasy, comfort, and even escape, while simultaneously offering complex and multivariant engagements with a wide range of topics and concerns, from the relational to the psychological to the social.
Come to me.
There will be spoilers for 2024's Nosferatu. At the time of recording, I know that it is going to be on video on demand around the 21st, which should be around when this video comes out. So if you haven't seen it, I guess TLDR, highly encourage you to do so. It's a really beautiful, complex Gothic story, and I think that Eggers always makes really engaging work, even if you end up not liking it at the end. Much like in Dracula, our male lead Thomas is sent to Transylvania in order to secure an estate deal with the mysterious Count Orlok. Freaked out from jump, Thomas is manipulated into dissolving his marriage and is imprisoned to be a feeding bag for Orlok and the wolves. Thankfully, he escapes. Meanwhile, Ellen, who has been a sleepwalker since her youth, finds the condition returning as Thomas is summoned and taken away. She senses the evil to come. Her concerns are dismissed as melancholy, and she is sent to stay at the home of her friend Anna and Anna's husband Frederick. Frederick is a hating-ass little bitch.
As I feared.
Well?
The longer Thomas is away, Ellen's condition worsens to the point where she is being drugged and tied to the bed for medical reasons. Dr. Wilhelm Siever decides to consult his old professor, von Franz, who quickly detects that Ellen is being haunted by a demon.
Curse?
Yes, cursed. This dear young creature is possessed of some spirit. Perhaps a demon.
I beg your pardon?
I assure you, Harding, the professor means this is hyperbole.
No! I mean a demon.
He sees Ellen's connection to the spiritual world and is one of the few to not be afraid of it. Although he is 20,000% okay eating her in front of some Nosferatu peen in order to save the day and stop the plague. So ally?
Talk, Valentina. Ally.
Thomas eventually does return home, but not before Orlok does a speed run through the Voyage of the Demeter and brings with him a scourge of plague rats. Orlok confronts Ellen and tells her that she has 3 days to submit to him, or he will kill everyone she loves, ending with Thomas. He does get a little amuse-bouche going with Anna and her children. Ellen resigns to giving herself up to Orlok sexually and spiritually. She succeeds in defeating Orlok, but at the cost of her own life, and manages to live just long enough for Thomas to hold her hand one last time. I deeply and intellectually enjoyed the movie. The performances were good, but I won't lie, I kept comparing Lily Rose Depp's performance to Eva Green's in Penny Dreadful, which is not fair to either person because they're very different stories. I will say, having seen the movie twice now, Lily Rose Depp really did impress me, and I think that her not being nominated would be like a massive snub, and it would mainly because it's a horror movie. Overall, it's such a very raw and intense performance that I think not many actresses would have fully committed to. I think after The Idol and all the Nepo baby conversation, she had a lot to prove and went for it. I actually think I ultimately prefer her to Anya Taylor-Joy in this role, because Anya Taylor-Joy is so striking that sometimes she is distracting in a movie like this. Bill Skarsgård is once again serving Lon Chaney Jr. realness. If there were weak links in the cast, I think maybe Aaron Taylor-Johnson and Emma Corrin were both kind of okay. Like, they're good actors, but their characters feel like red shirts. I think Corrin's Anna less so, because I think of the queer energy that Emma and Lily both bring to their performances. But I think that Anna, especially in this, really didn't get to do that much.
Tell me, what is this insufferable darkness?
Ellen totally encompasses the Gothic heroine and builds upon the template set by previous incarnations of that character, specifically in Nosferatu. In terms of Ellen Lucy, their representation with wavy dark hair, soulful eyes, demure and yielding adoration of their husbands, and prim corseted crinolines at the outset of the drama, loose nightgowns at the sacrificial conclusion, reflect a variety of late 18th, 19th, and early 20th century depictions of Gothic heroines who represent simultaneously persecuted victim and courageous heroine. Eggers has stated that he was more interested in making a version of Nosferatu than Dracula, but I think his film has a lot to thank from the energy and erotic fever of Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, especially when it comes to Ellen herself specifically. He also said that he found it more powerful that the film, the original Nosferatu, ended with the female character being the hero.
Something about the Murnau adaptation is just a simple fairy tale, and I actually think that simple fairy tale that is at the core of the Stoker novel is the thing that has made it like so adaptable and so versatile and kept people so inspired over the past century. And something that I really loved about the Murnau film is that, you know, it ends with the female protagonist being the heroine, and I thought that it would be like potentially more exciting if you know, the whole film is told through her eyes, because it had the potential to be more like emotionally and psychologically complex than an adventure story about a real estate agent.
So many moments in the film felt like a painting come to light. Many of the shots just blew me away. I think the film does suffer from being primarily vibes, but I think that's okay. That's part of what I love about this genre, is the energy, the vibe, the aesthetic. And I'm familiar with a lot of the images and motifs, so while I'm always curious about what new can be brought to it, especially with an eye like Eggers, I also have an appetite of my own for a little bit more from the genre, especially if we're going to do such a like intense budgeted and highly crafted movie like this. But I do feel like this version further illustrated one of my favorite German motifs that I think is very tied to the whole aesthetic of Nosferatu, which is the death and the maiden. A motif is like a distinctive feature or dominant idea in a artistic or literary composition. You also hear it a lot in music. For example, I've been listening to Epic a lot. They got me, and I was listening to it a lot. And so you'll hear, you know, when Penelope is being thought of or listened to, you'll hear a certain kind of music playing over and over again to symbolize her. That is a motif. That's kind of how you can tell she's not really there in the Sirens, because her motif is sounds a particular way, and it doesn't in this, so it tells you just, you know, audio wise that like, oh, that's not her. Also because, you know, why would she be in the ocean? The image of death in the maiden was a common motif in German painting and art during the Renaissance. It was traditionally the image of like a corpse or a skeleton as, you know, death personified, alongside like a half-dressed or naked young woman. One of the earliest and most notable remaining paintings of this is 1517's Death in the Maiden by Hans Baldung, complete with, you know, hair pulling. This element of death and a young woman has lingered and is heavily featured in other art dealing with the disconnect of vulnerability in youth, the way that it seems so tragic, especially when young people die. Ellen, especially in the final shot of this film, with the corpse of Orlok on her body, is so clearly building off of this motif. Unsurprisingly, it's just a very popular one as well. We have on the one hand the patriarchal eroticism of a young woman captured by death. On the other hand, you can revision it. There's a popular YA series I've read that has dealt with this. I forget the name of it. I think the first book is called Belladonna. Loved it. Because on the other hand, you can revision it as an embrace of the power of death, of taking back control from the ultimate patriarchal force. And also death can be a comfort for some, especially with those dealing with very heavy burdens and sorrows. You know, a melancholy goth girl can really find comfort in whatever. I think of, you know, Emily Dickinson.
I'm in love with death. He takes me out for a carriage ride every night. He's such a gentleman.
Ellen tells Thomas when he's about to leave that she had a dream of marrying death on her wedding day, a clear allusion to this motif and the complicated relationship that Ellen has to Orlok. Because you can do a lot, but you cannot hide from death. You can only fight it for so long before it catches up with you. And that fear is a part of Ellen's entire decision, in my opinion. The director of the 1922 film, F.W. Murnau, invented Ellen's fate, since Mina does not die in the books and Lucy is not bait for Dracula in the original novel. I also couldn't find this piece of folklore in any of my research about being a thing that stopped a vampire. So he introduces the idea of this willing, pure-hearted woman's sacrifice into the story, and I think it's all pulling from this source. In the script notes that Murnau left behind of the scene, it states the following: Nosferatu raises his head. He looks drunk with pleasure. Ellen's eyes are full of terrible fear. She must not allow Nosferatu just to go. She puts her arms around him. He cannot resist and bends his head over her again. In this version, Ellen is conquering death despite her fear, despite the fact that she will follow this force into oblivion. Because like any hero, fear doesn't stop you from doing the right thing. This is not how the newest adaptation deals with Ellen's choice, and it has been at the center of discussion about what Nosferatu is saying with the choice to make Ellen not only the protagonist, but to add this more overtly erotic sexual depth to her relationship with this monster.
You revel in my torture!
Upon the third night, you will submit, or he you call your husband shall perish by my hand.
No!
Hey, Editor Princess here. I wanted to just include some passages from this, from the Film Comment podcast of Robert Eggers talking about Nosferatu. I will, of course, link to it and everything else down below, but I wanted to play a few snippets from this interview because I feel like the interviewer and Eggers kind of go back and forth about a lot of my thoughts on the empowerment narrative, on, you know, if it's a sacrifice. So it's going to be peppered in throughout this later portion of the video. And I think it's just really interesting because I think Eggers is very aware of the tropes that he's playing in. Like, I would never say that he's doing it unintentionally. I think he is grappling with sort of like, you know, his own artistic desires and choosing, I think, which I think is the wise choice, is choosing what he thinks is artistically and narratively sound over trying to have any one particular like perfect message. I think that he trusts his audience to feel how they feel about it and to take out of it the artistry that he put into it. And I think as someone who like really enjoys this movie while critiquing it, I think that it's very true. I think that's also very true about The Northman. I think that's why The Northman is such a like very complex movie. This podcast sort of encapsulates the dialogue that I think is really key about the topics that we're going to get to in the second half of the video about the film. So yeah, just something to look forward to. Now, I am going to be totally transparent. The main reason I even wanted to make a video about Nosferatu is because of the discussion going around about consent and, you know, people arguing about who is the true media literate when it comes to Gothic fiction. And I just find that whole thing to be just fundamentally entertaining because I do love mess. It's a conversation that requires a lot more nuance and care for not just consuming the movie, but everyone else involved, that no one wants to do, because these conversations don't end up being about like how did everybody engage with the text or the medium or the art form. It's all about, no, you're wrong, you're the bad kind of person, you are not a true Gothic fan, you are not a true survivor, you are not a true blah blah blah. It's like, this is boring. And so I thought, you know, if I'm going to complain about it in my head for like hours and argue about it while watching TikToks, especially since TikTok no longer exists at the time of recording this. So yeah, the Discord was the main reason I went out and saw the movie twice. I have like my Alamo. You can see I wrote so many, you can't even tell because of the lighting, but I wrote a lot of notes on here. You can't tell, but it's true. When I watched Nosferatu the second time, I took notes with the discourse in mind around consent, because I wanted to make sure I was noting what the movie was saying overtly, and then think about how that connected to my own research up until that point, because I did write a bunch of this video before I saw it again, just to like, you know, refresh myself. In the opening scene, Ellen asks for a companion, first an angel of comfort and then any celestial being.
A guardian angel, a spirit of comfort, spirit of any celestial sphere.
Again, this is why when you invoke, you gotta know who you're invoking, girl. Okay? Because Orlok is the one who answers her call. Ellen also repeatedly refers to herself as a child when she meets Orlok. Considering the Victorians didn't have a concept of childhood, we can interpret her calling herself a child in multiple ways. A child could mean that she was, you know, literally a young child, or it could mean she was simply a virgin or sexually naive. I would state, however, in the shot you can see a dollhouse, or what looks like a dollhouse, in the background, so you could infer that maybe while not a young child, she could have been a young teenager, maybe 16. Lily Rose Depp herself is only like, what, 25 years old, so even if those few years are just her being in her late teens, early 20s, she could still be young. And I also kind of noted that as Ellen starts having these dark thoughts resurfacing, Anna and Frederick's two very young daughters, Clara and Louise, also start being afraid of a monster, and they will also eventually be killed by Orlok. And I just don't think that's a coincidence. Regardless, we quickly see that Ellen did call to someone, yes. She called to them out of distress. She asked for an angel, and she got a demon. It's just like swiping on the apps. There is minimal indication from their interactions, or even with their final confrontation, that Ellen fully understood what happened, enjoyed it, and wants it to happen. Her moments of pleasure are filmed similar to possessions in possession movies. She's in a constant state of distress. Whatever she may have consented to before, this is not what she wants now. And whatever she's being pulled to is not entirely herself. As a Gothic heroine, part of Ellen's narrative fits neatly into the concept of the marital Gothic. The heroine of the marital Gothic will always reawaken to the still present actuality of her trauma because of the gender expectations that deny her identity are woven into the very fabric of her culture, which perpetuates her trauma while denying its existence. While Thomas eventually recognizes Ellen's distress is rooted in truth, he initially disbelieves her. The modernized world treats things like demons as myths, and from the mouth of a woman, hysteria. To call the Gothic heroine a hysteric implies that she only imagines that she is being threatened, and that the menacing or seductive figure she describes are only projections of her own repressed desires. However, Gothic narratives by women are invariably socially grounded in situations of real danger to women's autonomy and safety. Underlying in the female Gothic is this reality. Ellen's fate across adaptations of Nosferatu is consistent. She sacrifices herself to the creature in a erotic moment of supplication and passive power in the face of a great force. And just to note, saying erotic does not mean it's meant to be sexy. Erotic can mean multiple things. Hi Lola, my cat just came out. I have seen the interviews with Lily Rose Depp and others saying that this is somewhat of a love triangle between Ellen, Thomas, and Orlok, that they're all kind of interwoven into this sexual, relationship. And that is true without it being sort of like capital R romantic. There's been a ton of very annoyingly simplistic back and forth about whether or not Ellen and Orlok's relationship and Orlok himself serve as a manifestation of her sexual desires, or if he's a predator taking advantage of the loneliness of a young girl. It's both. Like, it's all of it. That's what's so frustrating about this narrative of like, who's really reading Gothic romance? It's like, if we're really reading it, we know it's C, all of the above. As someone who has slowly seen the rise of things like dark romance, fan fiction in the public sphere, and other niche things becoming overwhelmingly popular online, I have tried to hold back my annoying preteen desire to gatekeep because I don't own these things. There have always been infighting in these spaces, and as a Black queer woman finding my own community in these spaces, I know that there will always require a bit more work for me to find my space there, and that it's always just going to be difficult. Fandom has never been a utopia, right? Like, it's not TikTok's fault. It's a bunch of different things. That being said, this discourse is a bit basic, respectfully. Vampires, Gothic horror, and even a lot of romance itself has a very narrow line between sexual assault and sexual pleasure. And I think the discomfort some people are feeling in this discussion about having to decide if it is or is not 100% sexual assault is having to sit with how much more they are into it than they expect. People who see Orlok as a manifestation of Ellen's sexual desire aren't wrong. However, that is simply the role of the vampire. It's not wrong because it's a very hyper simplistic take, because vampires and all monsters are manifestations of mankind's secret desires. That is their point. On the other side, and not all desires are good. Not all desires are meant to be acted upon. Desire is complex. That's part of the Gothic sexuality. It's not all healthy and good, especially for women. Slight spoilers, but I think the novel Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia gets this really well, with the main heroine being drawn to a very antagonistic male sexual force and having moments of like sexual attraction, but it's very clear from how the narrative is constructed that it's not entirely her, that it's cluttered through all these layers of supernatural manipulation. It is clear that whatever is going on is not fully her and also a part of her. It's both. But she would not choose that because she understands not everything you feel is meant to be acted upon. You can be attracted to somebody, but also know, ew, gross. I have seen people call Nosferatu a dark romance, a Gothic romance, a Gothic horror, as a way of saying that the film's sexual elements are meant to be dark, while also trying to distance that darkness away from the word.
She does have a choice, but it's almost like a false choice. There is a choice, but it's like a choice where she doesn't have much agency, and she has to make this decision of giving in to a man who has abused her and to a force that has held her in this grip between desire and control.
We have seen in the last almost decade a growing puritanical political backlash to sex in both left and right-leaning spaces. This idea that the media you like is a moral test of your personality entirely. And as a judgy snob who is friends with even judgier snobs, I think it is acceptable to disagree based on taste, and even to ask questions about people who uplift and center some art uncritically. Hard emphasis on uncritically. But that flattening is especially detrimental when we're talking about a genre like the Gothic that lives in the gray areas of morality. We have forgotten these darker narratives can and do exist in stories for a reason. Of course, they can be exploitative, but there are also reasons why they exist. For example, incest is a considerable part of the Gothic genre because of what it symbolizes in the shorthand about the family sickness and mental health, financial decline, moral decay, insular existences, a powerful patriarch or matriarch who stops the younger generation from evolving or escaping their circumstances, their state of existence. And this would get transferred to the Southern Gothic and used to symbolically show the decline of the agrarian planter Southern gentry of the South. That is why it's in the works of Faulkner. That's why it's in the work of V.C. Andrews. Hell, that's even to a degree why it's there in House of the Dragon with the Targaryens. Like, incest is always there to show something in decline within itself, essentially. That insulary situation and the dangers and the sexual exploitation that it can do. It's not just there to be scandalous or titillating. It symbolizes a society once noble, once plentiful in numbers and status, turning into these places, especially if they have those grand homes, into these cold, empty, dilapidated manners that can only be sustained by keeping these close-knit families together, even to their detriment. And incest are parts of storytelling, and we can and should point out and call out when it's done poorly, when it's exploitative, all of that. But they are also part of human life and experiences and a part of literature. You don't have to consume it, you don't have to like it, you should be able to opt out of it if you are just triggered by it, 1000%. It still has a place in art, especially art like this. As I mentioned in a previous video about monster romance, the popular romance novel The Sheik features a heroine being and abused by her love interest, but ends up falling in love with him despite it because she manages to change him. One of the most popular romance shows on streaming television had a major scene between its major relationship. The other most popular romance genre adjacent show has a in it nearly every season. Dubious consent is a popular kink and trope for a lot of people. Rape fantasies are common amongst women, even among those who are feminists, who are survivors. Some survivors get comfort and control from dark romance, and others do not and find it triggering. People are complicated. We live in a patriarchy. Women live in fear of violence from their romantic and sexual partners of all genders, but especially men. There is no denying that there is something worthy and essential to examine about the connection between those things, of the attraction to something that is so triggering and hard and scary. At the same time, does that mean we need to turn it into a kind of moral failing if you happen to like it? What happens then when all of a sudden you suddenly find yourself drawn to something or even aroused by something that you once considered problematic and you deeply stigmatize yourself? I think it's fine to get therapy and dissect those things, and I think we're human. Empowerment is complicated. Only one woman has ever directed a Dracula movie or a Dracula adaptation, and it was a Czechoslovakian 1971 black and white made-for-TV movie, and it's one of the most faithful adaptations. And even while it plays with the link between Mina and Dracula, it's clear that Mina is not choosing it. She is coerced into it, and she's not made less powerful because of it. There can still be yearning or eroticism because of it, but there isn't true consent. Vampires needing to be invited into a home is one of the oldest myths about them, alluding to the way that we can accidentally invite evil into our lives. You consent to let them in, but you're not consenting to being harmed after, because as we know, you could rescind consent at any time, but not to a monster. And there is this school of thought that resistance is necessary for the sensibilities of the time, and that the existence of that desire in the text speaks to something more profound and something being in the undertone. And I think that's also valid and a way to imbue a story with multiple realities of interpretation. But we also understand that the idea that a woman has to say no to say yes is also used to justify that is also morally dubious. Desire isn't something that you always act on. Just because you want something doesn't mean it's good for you. Ellen says in the film that she was dealing with mental anguish and called out to the universe for a companion.
I was so very alone, you see, and I wished for comfort, a presence, and the nightmares, the epilepsies,
And this force answered the call. It is clear from the opening sequence that this force started off gentle and then was violent and brutal in its lust for her. Nothing about how it was acted makes it look like something Ellen thoroughly enjoyed. And let us not forget that hypersexuality, which Ellen presents as Orlok comes closer, is also something that happens to victims of childhood sexual abuse. Does that mean that she was a victim of childhood sexual abuse? No, but that means that people who experience that can also see that in the narrative. The very nature of their relationship is complicated and dark. And if we're going to look to the Gothic for the rationale of it, we cannot ignore that it can be both a sexual desire and also sexual abuse, because that is what the monster does. I saw a comment on a video on TikTok of someone saying that they saw the relationship between Orlok and Ellen being about power and control, not sexual assault. Sexual assault is about power and control. And while I'm saying this very strongly, that isn't me shitting on any other interpretations of the film. I just have seen people say that people are ignoring Ellen's autonomy, and I don't think that's entirely true, and not what people are saying who disagree with it being a more positive story. Part of media literacy is understanding that a story will have multiple meanings. We can watch the same story and with our perspectives and tastes get a different feeling about what it does successfully and how we see it. Because I still love the movie and I like it. I just don't see it as like maybe the same kind of dark romance that some people are, at least not between Orlok and Ellen. I think it is between Thomas and Ellen, because Thomas is very much the prototypical like Gothic simpy boyfriend husband type. But if anything, I hope the conversation pushes people to re-examine their comfort zones regarding art, especially those who, like myself, claim to like dark romance, monster romance, and morally gray. When we have a work that plays with those elements explicitly, survivors can and will have many different ways of viewing this dynamic. I found Mary Beth McAndrew's interpretation of it on Dread Central as connecting to themes of surviving childhood sexual abuse just as moving as those who found a macabre beauty in viewing the moments of the end as Ellen taking sexual control and leaning into her own desires. For me personally, Ellen's ending is disappointing.
I had a Q&A the other night, and the journalist asked me the question, like, did I ever consider writing the film so that Ellen like wasn't made to sacrifice herself to like save everyone? And no, I never considered that, but I grappled with the implications of this because there is like a lot of feminist criticism about 19th century literature where discussing the issue of male authors writing a female heroine who's sexualized and her needing to die at the end of the novel.
Punished, yeah.
The author's unconscious desire to punish her. But there's also a lot of feminist criticism about, well, but isn't it interesting that this archetype of this female heroine who is the sort of savior of this repressed Victorian culture, being this sexualized woman who understands the dark side of humanity, and that character kept reappearing, and the power that character had and still does have. It's a sacrifice, but it is also vengeance, you know, and it is, but and also in a twisted way, it is also a sacred marriage and a coming together that is perhaps fated, but because as much as he is an abuser, like there is also something that like only he can give her and only she can give him. It's interesting that in today's culture, like it's bad for her to sacrifice herself. I don't know. Like, is sacrifice so bad?
It's interesting because I'm not even reading it as a sacrifice, you know? I mean, that's why, like, for me, I did not read the ending as empowered, but that made it a better horror film.
Sure.
Like, you know, that's how I read it. Like, I don't necessarily see it as a very empowered choice. I don't even see it as a sacrifice. I really see it as an illusion of choice that she had. This always had to happen this way. And there's a part of her that's like, I just want all this to be over. I've been tormented by this since I was a kid. Sure. I want this to be over.
When you make Lucy and Mina one person, we miss out on having any surviving women. You know, the link between the vampire and the maiden becomes something that drags them both down rather than something that the female character uses to defeat the man. You know, like Mina used Dracula's abuse of her to destroy him in the end. Even if she's not doing the stake, she is still using that and taking back control. I don't dismiss those who find Ellen's embrace of death a heroic action, because it is. I just think that the leaning on the sexual subtext at times obscures the fact that as much as we have reclaimed the sacrificial maiden in feminist reimaginings, it doesn't mean that trope is still not rooted in sexist paternalism. We have been tying women to rocks and sacrificing them to sea monsters and dragons and demons for millennia, and trying to make some peace with the fact that men, even those who see us as potential priestesses of Isis, have no problem doing that to us. All of the adaptations say that she has to willingly embrace him. What does that choice even mean when her best friend has been murdered? Children are dead, all to get to her. How would that weigh upon a soul already in crisis over a question of,
does evil come from within us or from beyond?
I think Nosferatu's biggest flaw is that it is a remake of a film with such a rich history that is so well known and so influential, and being tied to its beats. While researching this video, I ended up picking up the book Dancing with Ophelia, Reconnecting Madness, Creativity, and Love by Jean Ellen Petroli, where she examines how madness is depicted across religion, literature, and art. The title refers to Ophelia from Hamlet, who goes mad and drowns herself surrounded by flowers. That imagery has imprinted itself on sad women and femmes for generations. Ophelia, you will always be famous. Petroli says, in ancient literature, women did not venture into shadow territory as adventuring heroes like Eurydice or Persephone. They found themselves in the underworld only against their will, having made a fateful mistake or having been abducted, powerless to forge their own way home. These captives rely on a loved one, husband, mother, to cut a deal with the god that will free them from their underworld prison. Gothic literature brings the underworld into the domestic realm where women can exist. It is in the home, the husbands, the fathers, the brothers, because that force is just as overwhelming as the vampire that haunts you. At least the vampire is honest about what he wants. The focus on Ellen is subversive in some ways, but as someone who loves Gothic novels, especially the female Gothic, I think that Ellen living and not being heroic via her own death would be more satisfying to a modern day audience. Storytelling allows death to sometimes be its own victory, but to me, when I think of Gothic victories for women, I think of Edith Cushing at the end of Crimson Peak, even Evie in The Invitation, shout out to her, but not Vanessa Ives from Penny Dreadful. Like, we hate that ending for a reason. So for all the things the film does well, its loyalty to a conclusion where a heroine gives up her life to stop a monster that's been sexually tormenting her with a bit of her own body, I think she deserves to live, and I won't stop until she does. Ellen survives 2025.
Does it never call to you, urge you? Something is close at hand. That is his power.
Also in 2025, we need to bring back theater shame, because if you're coming to the Alamo Drafthouse and you cannot not look at your phone for the duration of the film, don't come. I don't want to see your phone. I don't want to hear you humming along to the music. I don't want to hear you laugh at every single pregnant fucking pause because you don't understand tension. Take that shit to the AMC.
We come to this place for magic.
Hi, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please like, share, and subscribe. This video was sponsored by my Patreon. I am so grateful to the members of my Patreon who have been so immensely supportive, especially these last couple of weeks. For those who don't know, one of my best friends passed away at the beginning of this year, and my intention at the beginning of this year was to sort of like take the month off to sort of just work on like maybe 1 or 2 videos for Nebula, do my usual like Patreon stuff, and then that happened and everything just kind of just shattered, and I just started throwing myself into work, and you know, then now having to worry about travel expenses for things and everything, and even though I've been good at budgeting, unexpected stuff is just a lot, so I was just like, let me get back to writing, and so I ended up watching Nosferatu again because I had seen it before his passing, and it is very surreal to watch a movie about a person being hunted by a monster and dealing with mental illness, and then also the death of a close friend when you're literally dealing with that at the moment. So it was definitely an elevated experience. I asked my friend BKR if I should do a main channel video on Nosferatu, which you are seeing now, or one about Demi Moore's history and her body being a topic of discourse, which I did for my Patreon instead. And she told me choose this one, and it was really cathartic to work on it during all this stuff. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoy. If this is your first time checking out my content, like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy. And I'm just really thankful for everyone. The survey, I promise, is down in the description below, and I'll put it in the community tab. It'll probably be there by the time those who watch this video watch it. And yeah, I'm just really, you know, when people talk about content creation, especially now that like TikTok at this moment is going to be banned from when I'm recording tomorrow, you know, content creation is so rewarding in so many ways. Then you have moments like this where you have to sort of like push yourself through mourning, through crisis to do it, because, you know, if you're not the most financially literate person when you start, you have a lot of catching up to do. And I certainly feel that way at times, but I'm also just very grateful for the privilege to get to do this and to get to turn like a movie that I enjoyed into part of the grieving process and drag you all along with me. So just take care of yourselves if you enjoy. Thank you so much. I also have links down below to charities that are going on to help people who were impacted by the wildlife fires. I have a link for the Creators for Palestine charity that has been ongoing. And yeah, they just thank you for watching. Thank you for being a part of this. Let me know what you think in the survey. And 2025 is at least for me, already shaping up to be a rough year, personally, but I hope that we'll get through it together. Because what else can we do? And so, yeah, thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of this. And I'm sorry this was such a depressing little ramble at the end of the video. That's why I don't do these.